Hey guys, welcome back this week. We are going to get into some lighting this week.
That's the exciting part. Lighting, I mean, we both love lighting. Lighting is one of the most fascinating part of sort of nature, in my opinion. Again, we're going to break this lighting into 2 weeks, right? It's a bit overwhelming at first, it might be. But yeah, we're going to break it down to sort of simple structures as always.
And hopefully, finally, we're going to break out of this diffused neutral light setup. And you're going to get to see, hopefully, where that's going, why we've been painting that way for so many weeks now. We have a lot of, this is a bit where we get into painting specifically digitally using Photoshop adjustment layers.
It'll be fun. So let's get started.
Okay, so lighting with values. We have a few examples to look at, real-life examples to look at that we photographed. This is basically the light setup that we've been painting for the last 4 weeks.
Neutral diffused light.
Yeah, so, you know, overall, let's just review what we know already. Overall, the light is coming in all sorts of directions, but universally, in this photo, actually, it's coming from a window. So universally, it's actually coming from a single direction. This is diffuse light, but keep in mind that diffuse light always has a direction. So, for instance, if we look closely at this photo, you can see, even though we have two upward-facing surfaces, because of the direction of the light, his nose, the bear's nose, is actually receiving less light than the top of his head.
Yep. But then because it's diffused, it still wraps around, which is kind of nice. You still have a bit of light hitting on top of his muzzle.
Right, so the top of his muzzle is still brighter than the bottom, or the side face. So if we took a look at this guy, this is what we know. And as the light begins to come into our studio, you'll see that the light actually hits this floor surface, and this is sunlight coming in. And the sunlight comes in one direction, hitting the surface, and then once it hits the surface, it actually diffuses. So it reflects off that surface and diffuses, kind of going off in all sorts of directions. And you can see here on the bear how it affects the lighting is that reflected light actually catches the bear on his side-facing plane.
Yeah, this is the fun part of lighting, huh? Just how light physically just hits, you know, and bounces off, and then just affects another surface, even though it's not coming directly from the light source. Just light just gets bounced off, and it gets weaker and weaker and weaker.
And, you know, keep in mind, too, that this actually is it bouncing off a wood surface. If the quality of that surface were different, the light might react differently. Yeah,
so you know, we've been studying this diffused light, and it's exactly that the floor surface has this rough texture on top of it, so it diffuses the light more than, for example, a mirror. Like if it's a mirror surface, it would actually reflect this light source much more clearly. It won't be as diffused, but in this case, it gets diffused off a lot more.
Yeah. So as the sun comes around, you can see how it affects the reflected light on the subject matter of our photo, which is this bear. So you can see that it kind of wraps around the bear, and as the bear gets immersed in light, you see how that reflected light gets really bright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the intensity of the sunlight kind of brings this intense bounce light. So even on his shadow side, it gets really bright, and you know the camera has a hard time sort of being able to capture both light side and shadow side. That's really interesting. We will get to the exposure later in this course, but it's a really interesting thing. Like when the light is so strong, like a sunlight, you can't really capture the light quality as much, so that in this particular exposure, the sunlit surface gets blown out.
Also, keep in mind that the shadow is affected by the light. So this kind of light is, universally coming in one direction, so you actually get a very crisp cast shadow. Up until now, we've had very diffused cast shadows based on the neutral diffuse light setup. Now that we have direct light coming universally from one direction, you're going to get a crisp cast shadow.
Yep.
So overall, we're going to be working in values. So these are those same 4 photos as light kind of creeped into our studio, how it affects the subject matter. So you can see on the left side is our neutral diffuse light setup. And then as the direct light comes on the far right, you see how the reflected light actually really affects the overall value of the shadow side of this bear. There's another quality of light, the light we want to talk, a property of the light we want to talk about also, which is intensity. Mm-hmm. So let's look back in a black and white still of this direct light. So what happens, this is sunlight, but what happens if actually the light intensity is different? In other words, if it were a light bulb, has less light intensity than the sun is probably one of the most intense light sources you can deal with. But what actually happens when the light intensity decreases? You might see something like this. Actually, want to talk us through some of the things that happens as light is less intense?
Yeah, you know, as the light intensity decreases, obviously the lit surface will go down in value, but also the amount of bounce light will be less as well, because the bounce will be also, the intensity will be less. And but it's really important that as the intensity decreases, does not mean it gets diffused. Like something that we may actually just in our heads that we may think that the intensity and the quality of light, whether it's diffused or direct, might have something to do with, but actually it's two separate things.
Yeah, and one thing I always like to think about, something that Dice, you talked to me about a long time ago, was actually if you look at a flame, for instance, in sunlight, it has very low impact. It actually has very little, if any, impact on things around it in daytime. Because the sun is so powerful and so intense, it really overpowers the light intensity of a flame, for instance. So if you think about that, I think that's a good way to start thinking that how light intensity might affect your image. Just quickly before we get to the next slide, just pay attention to the quality of cast shadow, which is always one of the best ways to identify whether the light is direct light or the diffuse light, and it still stays pretty sharp. And you might have the same experience with, say, like a desk lamp, spotlight created by desk lamp. You could definitely create a sharp, crisp cast shadow because it's coming from this small sort of intense concentrated light source as opposed to it's diffused out. So even the light isn't as strong as sunlight, it can definitely create direct light. Let's look at some kind of examples from paintings we've done in the past. So we've actually looked at this painting before, and this is the neutral diffuse light setup. This is a painting that Dice had done for Monsters University. But if we look at this, you have all the same things that we've been talking about. You see the local color. That's where a lot of the color is coming from, is local color of objects. You're also seeing the kind of softened shadow. Nice kind of, the darks are really coming from the contact shadows, or also kind of where light is not being received as much, like the interiors. And if we look at this, using adjustment layers, and this is something that we're going to begin to work on, using adjustment layers, Dice actually lit this scene. So let's take a look at this under a different lighting setup.
Yeah. What's really fun about doing something like this is that I had this sort of a neutral kind of overcast lighting before, and then now it's like towards like dusk, towards the time, like a magic hour almost. And what it does is that the sun is pretty much down, except for it's heading towards the top of the houses. But it's almost like towards the end of the day where even the sun is, kind of sinking down into the horizon. So it's very soft itself. And then you have this skylight, which does exactly the same kind of a job like top-down diffuse lighting. So when you think about it, when you think about skylight, the light coming from sky, it's basically a balanced light or reflected light off of the sun. And the sky particles is lit by the sun, so that's the light source. It's the diffuse light coming down, just like overcast clouds. So what changed really was only the temperature, the light direction, the quality of light really stayed the same. So everything looks exactly the same except for the temperature. And obviously I lit the interiors of the houses, but other than that, that was pretty easy transition.
Yeah, it's great. It's a neutral. It's instead of a neutral light setup, it's actually just you take the word neutral out. It's a kind of diffuse light setup from the blue sky fill, which is great. So that's one example to look at. We also have another example, kind of for the same film, but this is a neutral diffuse setup, kind of this amphitheater thing, and using adjustment layers, we lit it more appropriately to how it was going to be seen in the film. So what's great about this is, again, this is a good way to look at local colors, local materials, and using lights, you're almost turning things on to create this kind of night light setup. Overall, we had these kind of green, toxic green almost lights that we wanted to use for this particular sequence. But using the adjustment layers, we're basically lighting this whole scene. But you could kind of see there's a lot of adjustment from where it was. But again, it's a great way for me to really think about what the local materials are, what the local colors are, but then really focus in on a specific lighting setup for a different feeling.
Yeah, what's great about this painting is that this time you can kind of see that Robert's using this direct light. If you look at the screen left below, where this sort of a street lamp is casting this strong black shadow, you can see that's a direct light. So you're really trying to identify the quality of light, as you light the scene, and whether it's direct, whether it's diffused, or is it somewhere in between. You're making a decision as you paint.
Yeah. Let's take a look at an interior example. This is more similar to kind of our studio setup where, I imagine there's a window off behind us and neutral diffuse light is coming in. We see, Mike Wazowski from Monsters looking at this trophy. And then we also have another neutral diffuse light source coming from, around the corner, back around the corner. So you can see here, there is a direction to the light. But using, again, adjustment layers, we change the lighting and feeling of the room by creating these little sconces inside this hallway to really kind of create these little pools of light that we wanted going down the hallway.
Yeah, again, what's great about this is that, obviously the light sources, the location of the light sources are different, obviously, from the window versus sconces. But if you look at the quality of light, and this, sconces are creating this direct light. So Mike Wazowski's shadow is much crispier, and as opposed to the diffuse light setup, Mike's shadow is much more diffused, and that can actually convince the audience that what kind of light that he's in.
Yeah, and so just another example, but we have this neutral diffuse light setup in here in this really dark set actually overall, and we wanted to create a spotlight in here. So using one of the windows, this is where there's a bit of an exposure difference, but you can see some of the shadows got much darker just because the ability to kind of see the light. So we're exposing kind of for the shadow. We'll talk about this a lot more later. But the shadow gets really blown out, the light source gets really blown out, and then we get a bit of bounce light from that. But you can see this is like hardscrabble standing in the middle of the floor. You see this strong cast shadow again.